Dinosaur Museum virtual speaker series, where we have paleontology guests call in for a presentation on science, fossils, and dinosaurs, and where the public will be able to ask questions both here at the museum and live on YouTube. We want to acknowledge the homeland of the many diverse First Nations and Métis people whose ancestors have walked this land since time immemorial. We are grateful to work, live, and learn on the traditional territory of Treaty 8. Today, Dr. Jingmai O'Connor will be presenting the evolution of dinosaurian flight and the rise of birds. Dr. O'Connor was born and raised in Los Angeles, California, where she's streaming live to you now. Inspired by her mother, who is a geologist, Dr. O'Connor received her PhD doing research on fossil birds with Louis Chiappe at the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles. She worked at the Institute of Vertebrate Paleontology and Paleoanthropology in Beijing for the last 10 years, and will be starting at the Field Museum in Chicago in the fall as the curator of fossil reptiles. Thank you, and I will give the floor to you.
Thank you so much. Hi, my name is Jingmai O'Connor. It's really nice to meet everyone virtually. And I'm sorry about the technical difficulties, so I'm just going to skip with any other opening remarks and let's just go ahead and get started. So, you know, the fossil record is extremely incomplete, even though every day we are expanding it with new discoveries. So, you know, these tales of paleontology are stories of us making hypotheses with available information and then adjusting these hypotheses as soon as new information becomes available. So that's kind of a very fancy way of just saying we're usually wrong and we're always self-correcting. This is how science works. So I'm going to tell you the story of how our understanding of aves, or of birds, has self-corrected for the last 150 years. So this talk, it's rather long. I'm going to try to be on time and keep it tight, but it is a bit of a long talk. So I find that it works best if I break it into 3 parts. So in the first part, I talk about what do we mean when we talk about avian evolution. And then I'm going to give what I call a Paravian Anatomy 101 course, just so that you understand some of the key morphologies that I mentioned throughout this talk. And then I'm going to talk about what we thought we knew about birds prior to all these amazing discoveries that have come from China starting in the 90s, which is of course why I moved there to study them. And then I'm going to talk about these new discoveries. Then we'll move into looking at what groups of dinosaurs seem to be most closely related to birds, and of course about the evolution of flight within dinosaurs. And then last but not least, I'm going to introduce the Mesozoic aviary to you, all the different clades of birds that we know. And I'm going to talk about the evolution of modern avian physiology. Now, birds are the most successful group of vertebrates living on land today on this planet. So with anywhere between 10,000 and 18,000 species, that's more birds than if you took all species of mammals and all species of lizards and added them together. Now, birds are the only reptiles, the only extant reptiles, living reptiles, that are capable of powered flight. And powered flight is the most physically demanding form of locomotion utilized by any vertebrate. But birds are not only able to fly, but they are able to fly over the Himalayas, and they're able to migrate for thousands of miles. And you know, so birds are extremely well adapted for flight. And so, you know, every aspect of their biology has been adapted for flight in some way. For example, their respiratory apparatus has been adapted in order to be able to meet the oxygen demands of flight. Their digestive system is modified in order to meet the caloric demands of flight. Their reproductive system has been modified. Every part of their biology has been modified in some way for flight. And this is probably what has led to their extraordinary success. Not only their success in terms of diversity, but also birds are able to live in some of the most harsh environments on our planet, for example, penguins. Now, these, you know, biological adaptations, these physiological adaptations that I'm talking about are usually soft tissue features that are, you know, that are less likely to fossilize, you know, in the fossil record. So they go beyond the skeletal traces that are traditionally the skeletal changes that are traditionally tracked in the fossil record by paleontologists. So, because when we think of paleontology, we tend to think of just skeletons. You think of, you know, you picture the Gobi Desert and a white skeleton being weathered, you know, being weathered by the wind and exposed in the sand. But actually, you know, in the past decade, we've started to realize that soft tissues are far more commonly preserved in the fossil record than we have than we used to think. And a lot of these soft tissue traces are allowing us to understand how the physiological adaptations evolved within birds and how we came to the modern bird, which is one of the most successful organisms living on our planet. Now, when we talk about avian evolution, when we talk about Mesozoic avian evolution, we're actually talking about two different major transitions. And so the first transition is going from non-avian dinosaurs to the earliest birds, which were very different from living birds. And then the second transition we're talking about is the transition from the earliest birds, which were very primitive, to something that we would recognize as a modern bird. So that includes, massive skeletal modifications, but also some of these soft tissue physiological adaptations that I was hinting at in the beginning. So in order to understand these transitions, let's look a little bit at some para-avian anatomy, which means we're looking at non-avian dinosaur and a bird. So together these groups are para-aves. Now for our non-avian dinosaur representative, here we have Deinonychus, which is a dinosaur that needs no introduction, of course. And for our avian representative, we have a pigeon. Again, something I think that we're all very familiar with. Now, during the course of evolution from a non-avian dinosaur through early birds into a modern bird, a lot of skeletal changes happen. So for example, in the skull, one bone in particular, the premaxilla, becomes really big, whereas a lot of the other skull bones become very small. And also in birds, a lot of skull bones become reduced and even lost. And of course, dinosaurs mostly have teeth, whereas all living birds are edentulous, meaning that they have no teeth in their rostrum. And instead, the rostrum is covered by a keratinous sheath called the beak. Now, the sternum in non-avian dinosaurs consists of two very small flat plates. And in the course of avian evolution, this develops into these two plates fuse into an element that we call the sternum that becomes massively expanded. And this expansion is related to providing surface area for the huge muscles that are responsible for powered flight, mainly the pectoralis muscle, which is the chicken breast that we all eat. And this muscle, as you can see, it's very big. And in some birds, it even accounts for up to like 35% of their body mass. The long reptilian tail that's present in most non-avian dinosaurs becomes reduced, both in terms of overall length, but also in terms of the vertebrae that form the tail. And also the distal-most vertebrae become fused into an element that we call the pygostyle. And of course, this is something that's happened repeatedly in vertebrate evolution. Technically, humans also have a pygostyle, but we call it the coccyx. The hand also becomes reduced so that instead of having, 3 clawed fingers in dinosaurs that are most closely related to birds, modern birds have no claws on their fingers, and the bones that support the actual phalanges, the finger bones, become fused together, forming a carpometacarpus, and the actual fingers themselves become reduced. Now, the fusion of multiple elements into compound structures is something that we see repeatedly occurring in avian evolution. So, for example, these bones here, some part of the vertebral column, become fused together, forming a synsacrum, and similar to the way the hand bones become fused into a carpometacarpus, the same thing happens in the foot, forming a tarsometatarsus. And so these are just a few of the major skeletal transitions that we see occurring during early avian evolution. Now, the study of Mesozoic birds starts with the discovery of Archaeopteryx in 1861. But the first specimen of Archaeopteryx that was ever discovered was just this isolated feather. And actually, right now, we don't even know if this isolated feather belongs to Archaeopteryx. It could have been from anything that had feathers that was living in the Solnhofen at the time. But the discovery of this isolated feather and then later skeletal specimens that preserved feathers arranged into wings allowed for the immediate identification at that time of these fossils as birds, because in the late 1800s, the only animals that we knew of that had feathers were birds. So you discover something, a fossil with feathers, at the time they thought it must be a bird. Now, if you look at, just the skeleton of Archaeopteryx, it doesn't have any of these, skeletal modifications that I mentioned occurring in modern birds, right? You still still has teeth. The skull is has not, the bones haven't become fused and reduced. You still have these large hands with 3 claws. You have a elongate reptilian tail. So without the soft tissue preserved, without the preservation of feathers, we might not have identified Archaeopteryx as avian at all at that time. But because it preserved feathers and wings, Archaeopteryx was identified as the oldest bird. Now, I mentioned that Archaeopteryx is missing all these specialized features, that skeletal features that are indicative of flight in modern birds. However, this specimen has been studied for over 150 years, and the consensus of all this research is that Archaeopteryx was able to fly. It just didn't fly like a living bird. It must have had some much more limited and more primitive flight abilities. Now, the idea that birds are living dinosaurs is not a new idea. It's an idea that actually dates back to the discovery of Archaeopteryx. And it was a man named Thomas Huxley, who was often referred to as Darwin's bulldog. And I always thought this was because he was, staunchly defending Darwin's hypothesis of evolution. But I've since learned on the internet that it actually might be just because he looks like a bulldog. I don't know. But anyways, he studied Archaeopteryx, and he came up with the idea based on comparison with other small, other dinosaurs known at the time. He came up with the idea that birds may be related to small theropod dinosaurs. However, his, other scientists at the time rejected this hypothesis because at that time, no dinosaur fossil that we knew of preserved a wishbone or a furcula, which is, the bone that we all play with during Thanksgiving, or sorry, us Americans play with during Thanksgiving. So this hypothesis was rejected. And instead people thought that birds must have either evolved from crocodilians, the other extant lineage of archosaurs, or from some, at that time, as yet unknown archosaur, reptile. Now, so this way of thinking basically persisted until around the late 60s of the next century. And the idea that birds were living dinosaurs became resurrected by a man named John Ostrom. And he did a really, really intense and detailed study of the dinosaur Deinonychus, and also used a technique that at the time was fairly new, but now is very widespread, called cladistics. And based on his observations and also his use of cladistics, he decided that to resurrect this hypothesis, to again suggest that it seems from the evidence that birds must be living dinosaurs and that birds must be related to these small bipedal theropod dinosaurs. Now, again, this hypothesis was not well met. And a lot of people started to, this idea did become popular, but again, there were many people who rejected this hypothesis. And this time it was because of something that's called the temporal paradox. And this is because dinosaurs that were supposedly much closely related to birds were much younger than Archaeopteryx, the oldest bird. So how could how could birds have evolved from a group that does not appear in the fossil record until much later? Now, the fossil record of birds at the time was not lending any, was not shedding any or lending any insight into this, this question: where did birds evolve from? So the only fossil birds, Mesozoic birds that we had at the time were late Cretaceous taxa, meaning that they lived right before the big meteor impact. And these birds were essentially modern. Their post-cranial morphology looked almost exactly like that of living birds. I mean, they're not modern birds. They're not crown birds. You can see that they still retain teeth, but still their bodies were so derived, so modified that it wasn't providing any clues as to where birds might have evolved from. And then, the fossil record of birds starts to grow in the 1980s. So in 1981, a man named Cyril Walker studied this collection of bones from Argentina, from the late Cretaceous of Argentina, and he erected a new group of birds named the Enantiornithes. And this group of birds we now know to be the major avian radiation that occurred in the Cretaceous. But at the time, people also rejected this idea about the Enantiornithines. And this was because the group of bones that Cyril Walker studied were not articulated. They also represented more than one individual. And this was very clear from even, say looking at the foot bone, you can see that these foot bones are very different. So they're definitely from different animals, a diverse group of animals. And so therefore people thought that, all these weird features that supposedly characterize this group were maybe just features that were from different reptiles and were being stuck together into one group of birds. So basically this group could have been a chimera. So a lot of people didn't agree with Cyril Walker's original identification. Now, new discoveries of fossil birds from various places like Spain and also again in Argentina of articulated partial skeletons started to support this idea that Cyril Walker was right, because you could see the strange features that supposedly characterized enantiornithines were now found in articulated skeletons. However, the idea was still somewhat controversial. And then now we move into the discovery of fossils of Paravian fossils in China. So in 1992, the first fossil bird was found, but there was actually two specimens that were found, and they were found almost at exactly the same time. And they're very, very similar, but same but different. They are still thought to be distinct taxa. But again, these specimens were more complete than any, enantiornithine that had been found before. Almost the entire skeleton is present. The specimens are articulated. So this showed without a doubt that Cyril Walker was in fact correct about the identification he made with these disarticulated bones, that there really was this bizarre group of birds called enantiornithines that really did have all these weird morphologies. And so in 1992, this was the first fossil birds were discovered in China. Today, more than half of all Mesozoic birds that we know of come from China, not only in terms of number of specimens, but also in terms of diversity. More than half of all the species that we know of come from China, and they're almost all like this, very complete, sometimes preserving soft tissue, where again, specimens of fossil birds from elsewhere are much more fragmentary. Now, just a few years later, in 1996, the first feathered dinosaur is discovered. And so, we go back to this idea that at the time, birds were the only things known to have feathers. And now we have shown that feathers are actually a feature that are inherited from dinosaurs. And this is proven by the discovery of feathered dinosaurs. So this is one last piece of evidence to, further, or not the last piece, but this is another piece of evidence to support this idea that birds are in fact living dinosaurs. And shortly after, we found dinosaurs that not only preserved feathers like this dino fuzz that you can see on Scansoriopteryx, but dinosaurs were also found with modern looking feathers arranged into wing-like structures on the forelimbs, showing that the wing was also a feature that was inherited from dinosaurs by birds. Now, the discovery of these feathered dinosaurs in northeastern China in a region called Liaoning started this massive gold rush for fossils in this region, because one of these fossils many of these fossils, the early ones, were found by farmers. And so farmers realized that they could make a lot more money by digging up fossils than they could by farming, because it's a very rural area. People are very poor. So, we had amateur collectors popping up all over the place. Many new localities were being opened, and discoveries were being made in extremely high rate. And because of this really high rate of discovery, it wasn't until maybe about 10, 15 years ago that people realized that all these different localities in this region were not actually sampling one biota, but actually two biotas. So, and again, the fossils that they're found in these two biotas are very similar, but also more than that, the depositional environment was the same, which made it very difficult to realize that one deposit was actually made 30 million years before the other, because it's all volcanolacustrine. So eventually, scientists realized that one locality in particular, and also some other localities surrounding it, the Daohugo locality, was actually revealing this older fauna, this which we now call the Yanliao biota or the Daohugo biota, and it's 30 million years older than this Zheho biota that had been producing all these early birds. Now, the Yanliao biota has produced more than 200, probably about 300 specimens of a small feathered dinosaur named Anchiornis that is most likely a troodontid dinosaur. And you can see it looks very similar to Archaeopteryx. It has, again, I won't get into the details since we don't have time, but you can take my word for it. It looks very similar to Archaeopteryx. And if you look at the age of the biota compared to Archaeopteryx, it's older. So now we have dinosaurs, small bipedal theropod dinosaurs that skeletally are very similar to birds, but are older than the oldest fossil bird. So there's essentially no more temporal paradox. And so this was one of the last things that people were holding against the idea that birds are living dinosaurs. So now, there aren't any strong arguments to hold against this hypothesis. And it is basically accepted by the paleontological community that birds are living dinosaurs. So to kind of recap, how our understanding of birds has changed in the last, 150 years. When Archaeopteryx was discovered, Archaeopteryx had feathers, so it could be immediately identified as a bird because only birds had feathers at the time. But then we discovered feathered dinosaurs. Well, then we thought, okay, well, a bird is a feathered dinosaur with wings. But then very quickly, feathered dinosaurs with wings were discovered. But you can tell from the proportions of this animal, it's an Oviraptorosaur called Caudipteryx, that these wings are proportionately very small. So this tells us that this dinosaur wasn't flying. So then we thought that maybe birds are dinosaurs with feathers forming wings that are able to fly. And this was essentially the way of thinking when I entered grad school, which was 15 years ago. So when this is bringing us up to about 2010 and Jingmai's 2005. Jingmai's just starting her PhD, and so how do we define a bird? As I said, it might be defined by the fact that it can fly, but flight is it's not a feature that you can just point to on a skeleton, right? So the last time somebody actually tried to define birds with things that you can just point to was 1954. So that was a really long time ago. And even at that time, this man named De Beer could only come up with 4 features that he thought distinguished birds from all other animals. And this was the presence of feathers, which we now know are actually present in a more inclusive group of dinosaurs, the presence of a retrovuted pubis, which is actually not present in the earliest birds, a reversed helix, same, not present in Archaeopteryx, and a furcula, which again, now we know is actually inherited. It's from dinosaurs. So we actually right now have no definition that we can use for birds. So we can't point to Archaeopteryx and say, this is what makes Archaeopteryx a bird, and the absence of that feature is what makes Anchiornis not a bird. There's nothing really that we can point to right now. So when we try to define Aves, we have to again rely on that that technique that I mentioned that John Ostrom used called cladistics, and we use what we call node-based definitions. So we just these cladistics is what produces these phylogenetic trees, these trees of life that basically tell us how organisms are related to each other. So we basically take the node with Archaeopteryx, and then over here with the Passer domesticus, which is a house sparrow. And then we basically draw down and say, the common ancestor of Archaeopteryx and the sparrow, and all its descendants. That's what we are considering birds. But again, that's something that you can't necessarily just point to features. If you discover a fossil, you can't say, oh, that's a bird or not. You have to actually run it into one of these cladistic analyses. So node-based definitions are limited, is I guess what I'm trying to say. Now, I know that this isn't necessarily more helpful for paleontologists. In fact, it's not. But I had the idea that, if birds are so adapted for flight, modern birds, all the aspects of their physiology has been modified in some way. So there must be physiological modifications that separate birds from non-avian dinosaurs, some kind of physiological adaptations that facilitated the evolution of flight. So I came up with the idea that maybe we could come up with what I called a biological definition for Aves. So pointing to some of these, physiological features and see if we can use those to distinguish birds. So that's what I'm going to get into at the last part of the talk when I talk about the rise of birds. But first, let's talk about this. Let's talk about flight, because at the time we thought that we could say that flying dinosaurs were birds. So again, because we thought all flying dinosaurs were birds, the idea of how did flight evolve in dinosaurs and how did birds evolve at the time was considered to be essentially the same evolutionary question, right? And so there was a lot of research being done to understand how did dinosaurs evolve flight? How did they become birds? How did they become airborne? And basically everyone doing research on this area kind of got split into two camps, like two opposing hypotheses. And one of them is called the trees down hypothesis. And that says that, hey, it's too difficult to evolve flight going against gravity. So you have to go with gravity. So the, flight evolved first in some scansorial animal, basically meaning that they climb in trees. And this scansorial arboreal small theropod dinosaur had feathers on its forelimbs, and it was jumping from branch to branch. And these feathers on its forelimbs allowed it to, kind of glide a little bit. And eventually, and this caused natural selection to evolve for larger feathered surface, surface areas created by feathers on the forelimbs, allowing it to glide better. And eventually this led to flight that we see in birds. So this is important because it infers that there must be an intermediate gliding stage in the evolution of powered flight. So I should just, I guess I should just clarify this quickly. There are many animals that fly, but some animals glide and some animals use powered flight, which means like, a bat or a bird, they're actually using wing beats in order to sustain their, to sustain themselves in the air. Whereas a lot of other animals glide, like for example, a flying squirrel, it's not actually flapping its forelimbs or anything. It's just gliding on these airfoils. Now, the second hypothesis is called the ground up hypothesis. And this hypothesis says, well, I understand that it's more difficult to evolve flight going against gravity, but the fact is that all the dinosaurs that we think are most closely related to birds are animals that are living on the ground. So this hypothesis thought that, well, these small theropod dinosaurs, little wings on their forelimbs, they're running around, and these little proto-wings are allowing them to jump higher and run faster. And of course, this is advantageous. So natural selection produces larger and larger airfoils on the forelimbs until the surface area is so large that it's capable of producing lift that counteracts the normal force created by gravity. And boom, your bird or your feathered dinosaur is now airborne. So this hypothesis infers that powered flight was evolved directly with no intermediate gliding stage. Now let's look at the dinosaurs that are all potential candidates for being the closest relative to birds. Well, since the early discovery of feathered dinosaurs in China, many other feathered dinosaurs have been found, including, for example, Eutyrannus, which is a relative of Tyrannosaurus rex. So we actually know that feather-like integumentary structures had a very broad, they were broadly dispersed throughout Dinosauria. And in fact, these kind of proto-feather, dino fuzz-like structures may even not be unique to dinosaurs themselves, because there's also been some weird hairy-like structures that have been found in pterosaurs, which are the sister taxon to the Dinosauria. However, complex feathers that have a modern structure are limited to a very small group of dinosaurs. So this type of feather is what we call a pennaceous feather. And it basically is a type of feather that has this spine dividing down the middle, which is called the rachis. And then on either side of the spine, you have these, what's called pennaceous vein, but it's feather vein that can do that like zipper thing. I'm sure we've all played with feathers and you see how these feathers feathers have barbs with them that have barbules and barbicets that interlock with them, which allows that feather to do the little zipping thing when you play with it. So anyways, this type of feather is only found in 3 groups of non-avian dinosaurs, and those are Oviraptorosaurs, and then Troodontids and dromaeosaurids. So let's take a look at these 3 groups because we believe that dinosaurs must have evolved from one of them. Now, the Oviraptorosauria, most people these days no longer think that Oviraptorosaurs had a very, very close relation with birds. But at some time, people thought that maybe birds evolved from this group of dinosaurs. And some people have even thought and still do think that these dinosaurs are actually secondarily flightless birds. So they actually are birds, not birds evolving from them. And this group of, I believe that they're just, that they are a primitive group of dinosaurs not very closely related to birds, but there's a large number of morphological features and also behavioral features that do link birds and this group of dinosaurs. So for example, the famous nesting dinosaurs that are preserved in what appears to be either nest protection or possibly even some kind of contact incubation. If it was contact incubation, it could be very similar to modern birds. Nowadays, the newest thinking is actually that they maybe didn't even protect their nests at all, but that this Oviraptorosaur just was killed while it was adding to this ring of eggs that it's sitting on. But, like I said, fossil record is incomplete. Our understanding is constantly changing. So our interpretation of these specimens will change in the future. And Oviraptorosaurs also, of course, include the earliest dinosaurs that were found with small proto-wings on their forelimbs. Dromaeosauridae is the group of dinosaurs that includes Deinonychus, and that, of course, John Ostrom used to unite birds and dinosaurs together. And since John Ostrom's study in 1969, there has been new evidence that's come forward that again supports the idea that birds and this group of dinosaurs was closely related. For example, the discovery of dromaeosaurs with large wings on their forelimbs. But again, you can see that this forelimb is very short compared to the leg. And again, this animal was probably not capable of flight. Now, spoiler alert, Troodontids seem to be the group of dinosaurs that are increasingly, evidence is increasingly mounting to support the idea that birds are actually living troodontids. And so, for example, troodontids have a slightly larger brain size than other dinosaurs. And of course, increased brain size is something that we see in birds. Again, of course, we have taxa that have proto-wings, other forelimbs. And again, we have behavioral evidence that links this group and birds. For example, here is a little troodontid named Meilong, which means sleeping dragon. And you can see its forelimb here. It's sleeping basically like a modern duck with its head tucked underneath its wing. And there's a lot of other small, many other smaller lines of evidence that do again support that birds and troodontids, that birds are most closely related to troodontids than any other group of non-avian dinosaur. With one exception, actually. And so that is this group of dinosaurs called the Scansoriopterygidae. Which is probably the most annoying name to say ever, but they are my favorite group of dinosaurs because they are really weird. And they were only first discovered in 2002. So we've known about this group for less than 20 years, and there's only about 5 specimens that have been found. So they're extremely enigmatic. There's a lot we don't know about them. But when this group of dinosaurs was first discovered, people put them into cladistic analyses, and the cladistic analyses told us that this group of dinosaurs is most closely related to birds. So can't argue with cladistic analysis, right? So now let's talk about the evolution of dinosaurian flight. Now, all these amazing fossils coming from China have shown us that birds inherited wings from dinosaurs. But not only did dinosaurs have small proto-wings on their forelimbs, but they also had small wings on their hind limbs. And, the fact is that right now we still do not know why feathers evolved to begin with. We don't know why feathers evolved these increasingly more complex morphologies that culminated in this pennaceous feather capable of doing a little zipper thingy. And we don't know why wings, proto-wings, feathers arranged on the forelimb into a wing-like structure, we do not know why that evolved. We have hypotheses, but we really don't know right now. So, I mean, I would say that most likely it was driven by sexual selection, because we do see a lot of morphologies that seem to have no other function, like feather morphologies, that seem to have no other function other than perhaps some kind of display, you know, whether it be for females or to drive off males, or, I mean, we don't know, obviously, but I would say that was probably what was driving this evolution of feathers and feather structures. However, that's something that's basically impossible to test in the fossil record. So, you know, it's really hard to move these type of hypotheses forward. Now, the other hypothesis is that, you know, these proto-wings may have had some incipient aerodynamic function. And this makes sense for them to become enlarged. You know, it would make sense that they had some incipient aerodynamic function that then caused natural selection to produce larger and larger airfoils on the forelimbs and maybe also on the hindlimbs. And this is something that you can test. So, myself and fellow Canadian colleague Corwin Sullivan, we teamed up with a group of scientists at Beijing's Tsinghua University, which is supposedly the best science and technology university in China. And they wanted to see if they could test this idea about the incipient aerodynamic function of these wings in Caudipteryx, which is the most primitive dinosaur that has wing-like structures on its forelimbs. And unfortunately, I'm really bad with technology. Otherwise, I would have added videos for you here. But you can see that some of the hilarious things that we did in order to seriously try to study this evolutionary question included building a robot Caudipteryx, and also building robot Caudipteryx wings and strapping them onto baby ostriches and chasing them around so you could like figure out what aerodynamic, you know, forces were being generated by these wings. Anyways, I don't know how to get videos to work in a talk, so I didn't try it. But if you guys have time, I highly recommend looking up these papers, going onto the supplemental information, and watching these hilarious videos of robots and ostriches. Anyways, but what these experiments did tell us was, yes, that these wings definitely were not capable of allowing Caudipteryx to fly, but they did have some incipient function that would have helped them to run, it would have helped them to keep balance while running, and possibly also may have been useful during maneuvers such as turning. Now, back in 1915, there was a guy, a scientist named Beebe, who came up with the idea that when reptiles evolved into birds, that they may have gone through a four-winged stage called a tetrapteryx. And this idea gained a lot of popularity almost 100 years later with the discovery of this dinosaur from Liaoning, from northeastern China, called Microraptor. And so Microraptor, you can see, has these long feathers on its forelimb, and it also has very, very long forelimbs feathers on its hind limb. So this, you know, made everybody really excited. Maybe Beebe was right, and you know, flight in dinosaurs evolved through a four-wing stage. And so this led to the idea that people started saying that any feathers on the leg were hind limb wings, right? But what makes a wing a wing? It's not just having feathers on some part of your body. That doesn't make it a wing. You have to have feathers in a very specific morphology and arrangement. So here we have a little hummingbird for an example of a living bird, and here we have like a drawing of a modern bird's wing. And you can see that the longest feathers in the wing are located at the distal most portion of the limb. And here, in this case, it's the forelimb. And you can also see that the feathers that are the distal most feathers, these largest feathers forming the wing structure, are strongly asymmetrical. So this means that one of the veins on one side is much narrower than the vein on the other side. And this is called the leading edge vein, because this is the direction that air is coming from. And this is called the trailing edge vein. Now, so like I said, people started saying that any feathers on a hind limb must be a wing, but is that true? Let's look at the structure of these feathers on the hind limb. So for example, here, let's start, this is Archaeopteryx. Let's start with Archaeopteryx. Here you can see the feathers, and you can see that they're getting shorter and shorter and shorter to where they end on the hind limb. So that doesn't really fit, you know, the morphology that we described for a wing, right? They should be getting longer distally, not shorter. And again, you can see the same thing here on Anchiornis. The feathers are quite short distally. But if you look at Microraptor, you can see that the longest feathers on the leg are on the distal most portion of the leg, consistent with a wing. And if you look at these feathers, the hind limb feathers and also the forelimb feathers, if you look at them closely, you can also see this vein asymmetry that we described are always present in the wing feathers that are, that are used for flight, the primary wing feathers. So we have, basically the hind limb wing in Microraptor checks these boxes for what makes something actually a wing versus just a feathered appendage. Now, also, these are some cladograms that we're talking about, that these are the things that are generated with cladistic analyses, but you can also see that from some recent analyses, here's Microraptor, here, the group that includes Microraptor, and then here's birds over here. So basically, you can see that since all these guys are not flying, just one group nested within, that means that flight in Microraptor must have evolved independent of flight evolving in birds. So this means that Microraptor is a flying dinosaur, and that flight evolved in this group completely independent of birds. So now we know that not all flying dinosaurs are birds. So we cannot say that the evolutionary question, flight evolving in birds and the evolution of birds, flight evolving in dinosaurs and the evolution of birds, these are no longer the exact same evolutionary question. These questions have now been decoupled. Now let's also take a look at these Scansoriopterygids, these dinosaurs that I kept telling you that cladistic analyses keep telling us are very closely related to birds. In fact, more closely related to birds than any other dinosaur. Now, we have about 5 specimens, but none of them preserve this modern feather morphology, this pennaceous feather morphology that I was mentioning. And remember, I said that, birds had to have evolved from a group that has that type of feather, since they use those feathers for flight. Now, there are these weird tail feathers in one specimen called Epidexipteryx, and they look like weird tail feathers in some fossil birds. So some people have used this to infer that Scansoriopterygids did have pennaceous feathers. Honestly, we still don't know right now. There's just so much that we don't know about this really bizarre group. But in 2015, another specimen of Scansoriopterygid was discovered, and it's named Yi Qi, which means, strange wing in Chinese. So that's kind of a huge giveaway right there. But I remember going to the Tianyu Museum of Natural History in Shandong province in China. And I went there with Corwin Sullivan, who I know is, a member of this wonderful museum, the Philip J. Curie Museum. So, and we're looking at the specimen, and we see this weird bone coming out of the wrist. And this bone is just not present in any other dinosaur. And all of us were kind of scratching our heads, like had no idea what it was. I remember saying like, oh, maybe it's like a piece of plant material that's just underlying it. Like we just couldn't figure out what it was. And then Corwin, he goes back to Beijing. We all go back to Beijing. And Corwin was working on this book called From Fish to Humans, which has won a lot of awards. And he's doing research on flying squirrels. And flying squirrels have this bone that sticks out of the wrist. And Corwin has this like light bulb over the head moment where he realizes that, that bone that we were looking at in the wrist of this dinosaur may be something very similar to what he was reading about in flying squirrels. And so, the leader of this study, a guy named Xu Xing, who I know has also visited the Philip J. Curie Museum and given a lovely talk, he goes back and he studies the specimen again. And sure enough, not only do we sample this little element to prove that it is bone, but also he found soft tissue traces also preserved around the bone that we interpreted as being remnants of a membrane that was used for flight. So birds and Microraptor fly with wings that are mostly formed of feathers, but flying squirrels and bats and pterosaurs fly with wings that are actually formed by flaps of skin. That sounds so disgusting, I know, but they're called patagia. That's like the fancy term for it. Skin flaps, so gross, but that's what they use. And so this means that we have now another group of dinosaur that was capable of flight, but a totally different type of flight than we are observing in birds and also Microraptor. So, this is a reconstruction to help you visualize it. Again, here you can see the type of wing that Microraptor and birds use. Of course, Microraptor also has one of these wings on its leg, which birds do not have. And then this is what we hypothesize that the membranous wing of Scansoriopterygids might have looked like. I mean, the wings are, the animals preserved like not in perfect articulation. And so we don't really know the exact extent of this feather membrane. We don't know, how big it was, where it connected. But again, there's only like 5 or 6 specimens known. So with every new specimen, we are starting to understand more about this group. But one thing that I also think is really interesting is you see that it has this really long third finger on the hand. So when this was first described, people actually thought that this was something like, we're trying to figure out what this long digit did, right? What was its function? And, us paleontologists, the human imagination is quite limited, and so when we try to understand what an extinct animal was doing, we look at living animals and we try to look for similar structures. And so the only living animal with one finger that's really long is the eye. So this is primate that uses this really long finger for probing into rotting wood to pull out like bugs and things. So when the first Scansoriopterygid was described, they thought, well, maybe this long finger was for doing, was a feeding adaptation. But then with the discovery of more complete specimens and the discovery of specimens that preserved soft tissue, we are able to now understand that this elongate finger was actually for supporting a membranous wing. So, if you look at these wing structures, a membranous wing versus a wing formed out of feathers, these are such completely different structures that to me, it really strongly indicates that we have very different evolutionary origins. These are clearly independent origins of flight. However, to be a good scientist and be fair, I do have to at least mention to you that there are some people who actually believe that the common ancestor of all these flying dinosaurs had flight, and so that Microraptor, Scansoriopterygids, and birds retained flight from that flying ancestor, and that everything else like Deinonychus and that doesn't fly has secondarily lost flight. And that is possible, but I think that the evidence is more strongly pointing to the fact that flight evolved in dinosaurs multiple times. Like I've just mentioned 3 different origins of flight to you, and I actually think that there's at least 2 other origins of flight. One of them, it's not published, so I should probably wait until I've proved it. But there's also another dromaeosaur dinosaur from Madagascar from the late Cretaceous called Rahonavis. It was originally identified as a bird, but it's probably just because it's a flying dromaeosaur and it's so distantly related from Microraptor that it must be another independent origin of flight. So, it's kind of crazy to think about because power flight is this really demanding, very difficult form of locomotion. There already were flying reptiles around at the time, the pterosaurs. So for all these dinosaurs to evolve flight, they had to compete with pterosaurs, but for some reason it did. And we actually right now have no idea why flight evolved so many times around one period of time anyways. But this is something that we're just starting to understand now. And I think in the next 10 years, we're probably going to uncover more flying dinosaurs and also start to understand a little bit more about why this happened. So I just want to quickly mention there's another Scansoriopterygid that was named just last year, and we got it on the cover of Nature. I don't know how that happened, but we'll take it. And it was really cool because this study just showed again that this styliform process, this bone that sticks out of the wrist, is indeed a widespread feature in Scansoriopterygids. Again, we found traces of the skin of the wing membrane. Again, found no presence of pennaceous feathers, just kind of dino fuzz. But in this cool study by in this cool analysis by the lead author Wang Min, he was able to show that in all flying dinosaurs, the forelimb becomes elongate in order to create a bigger wing. But he was able to show that this happens differently in birds compared to Scansoriopterygids. So birds tend to make the hand even longer, which makes sense because that supports the primary feathers that are responsible for flight. Whereas in Scansoriopterygids, they actually make the humerus longer. And so there's different evolutionary pathways to creating this elongate forelimb for a wing, which again supports the idea that these are 2 independent origins. But this is actually why Scansoriopterygids look like they're so closely related to birds, because there's all these features that link them to birds, but it's not because they're related to each other. It's because both groups are flying. So they have independently but convergently evolved many similar features. So when we look at a lot of dinosaurs, we're like, there's so much, are dinosaurs closely related to birds? We say there's so much homoplasy, like the same things keep evolving repeatedly. And now we're starting to understand that a lot of this is because flight itself is evolving repeatedly. And so all these animals that fly are dealing with the same aerodynamic constraints. And so they're solving these problems in similar ways by, like, say, elongating the forelimb, etc. And this, of course, brings us to birds, which is the third independent origin of flight that I'm going to go into in any detail, except I'm not actually going to go into it in detail. We can all look out the window and see flying birds. But one thing that, like, I want to repeat, I guess, is that, now all the research that has been done saying how did dinosaurs evolve flight, this now basically applies only to how did avian dinosaurs evolve flight. This is basically, this discovery of all these other flying dinosaurs has opened the door for all these new areas of research to say, well, how did Scansoriopterygid dinosaurs evolve flight? How did Microraptor evolve flight? How did Aves? And also, how did birds evolve flight? But of course, since in the last 10, 15 years, there has been major leaps and improvements in our understanding of how we think bird flight evolved. So remember, before I mentioned this dichotomy, this trees down or the ground up hypotheses, these competing hypotheses for flight. Well, first of all, if you ever see anything in a dichotomy, it should immediately be an alarm bell for you that they can't both be right. Like, it's not like it's not that one of them is right and one is wrong. It's like they're probably both wrong. And so actually the current hypothesis for how birds evolve flight is called the ontogenic transitional wing hypothesis. And this hypothesis arose from studying little baby birds, because little baby birds that are precocial, so like, for example, a baby duck that's running around, but it can't fly yet, right? So they have these like tiny little wings. And as they get older, the wings become bigger and they start to have adult, like, pernicious feathers instead of just a little fuzz that you see on a baby duck. And these feathers become, they get molted and they come back in even longer, and they get molted again and they come back even longer, and now asymmetrical. So we think that this ontogeny of these little precocial birds is probably kind of mirroring how flight evolved in the avian lineage, at least. So here you have a subadult that still doesn't quite have the adult plumage, so it still can't really fly as well as an adult bird. Also, its sternum isn't fully ossified yet, so maybe that kind of mirrors what we see in taxa like, Archaeopteryx, which doesn't have an ossified sternum at all. And it's capable of flying, but it's not capable of flying as well as a fully mature adult. So, I would guess that something like this is a proxy for the type of flight that we see in Archaeopteryx. Okay, so now let's talk about, now we've covered the Dinosaurian flight, but now let's go into the rise of birds. And I say the rise of birds because, early birds were not nearly as successful as modern birds. And so during their early evolution, they start to accrue these more derived features. They start to accrue these physiological adaptations that allow them to be more successful. And eventually you get into a lineage that has all these adaptations together, and they just explode after the Cretaceous extinction and just become the most diverse group of vertebrates on the planet, on planet. Okay. So this is a simplified time-scaled phylogeny of all tetrapods. And within this box here, you have all birds. And within this box here, you have all birds that are represented in the Jehol avifauna. So this is this avifauna that I mentioned from northeastern China. And basically this avifauna is the most diverse avifauna known to science, and it preserves every single lineage of early Cretaceous bird that we know of. And which basically means all lineages of Cretaceous birds, with the exception of one lineage called the Ornithurae, which is limited to much younger deposits. So now the Jehol biota occurs in 3 different formations. It's not important, their names. The only thing that I would like you to glean from this slide is that as we go from the oldest portion of the Jiahu biota, which is the Huajiying Formation, it's about 130, 129 million years old. And then we go into the Yishan Formation, and then the Jiufotang Formation being the youngest, you see the diversity of birds increasing. So in the Huajiying, there's only a few, there's like 6 different taxa. And then by the time you get to the Jiufotang, we have like 40 different species of birds. So this is an artist's representation of what the Jiufotang avifauna would have looked like, which remember is this is the most diverse part of the Jiahu biota, the youngest part. And I'm just going to briefly introduce the major lineages to you, starting with Zhaoianus, which is my favorite group of birds. And they're the only other group of birds besides Archaeopteryx that still retains this elongate dinosaurian tail. And these birds are pretty big too. They're about the size of a turkey. And the cool thing is, again, the understanding of Zhaoianus and its bizarrely elongate tail is another story of how much we rely on soft tissue in order to understand fossils. So the holotype of Zhaoianus did not preserve any feathers. But if you looked at the tail was longer than that of Archaeopteryx. And this is both in terms of the number of vertebrae, but also in terms of overall length. And this is really weird, right? Because Zhaoianus is more derived than Archaeopteryx. So it's closer to crown birds, to living birds, than it is to Archaeopteryx. But even though all living birds have this abbreviated tail, Zhaoianus's tail is evolving the opposite direction. It's getting longer, right? And so this was described as mosaic evolution, which I think just a way of saying like, we don't know what it means. And yeah, and so for many years, we did not know why the tail was longer. And then specimens preserving soft tissue were discovered. And so you can see here that what we found was that Zhaoianus actually has 2 feather tracks. So if you look at the tail of Archaeopteryx, there's feathers all along the entire tail, forming what we call like a frond morphology. But then in Zhaoianus, you have the feathers restricted into 2 patches. So you have this little distal patch here, and then you have this proximal patch here, just kind of on top of the butt, I guess. And, you know, doing a little bit of math, which I did not do. I think we had Crowan's brother help us. But we did some math and we were able to show that this morphology was actually more efficient for flight. And that this little tiny patch of feathers here could create just as much lift as the feathers, the big frond-shaped tail in Archaeopteryx. Except the big frond-shaped tail of Archaeopteryx also was, you know, if you have a lot of feathers, it creates a lot of weight and a lot of drag. So that actually makes it difficult to fly. So by limiting these feathers into these 2 discrete patches, Zhaoianus was also evolving a tail that had less drag. And then this distal tail palm or a frond, we think is mostly shaped by sexual selection, that it might be some kind of ornament. As you see, it's very, very pretty looking. But we're also able to show that the proximal portions of these feathers where they overlap could still generate some aerodynamic forces. And that by raising the tail and lowering the tail while Zhaoianus was flying, it was able to generate pitching forces that would have allowed it to use its tail as a flight stabilizer. Now, here's the cool part. If you move this distal tail fan further away from the body, you are increasing the moment arm of the pitching forces that tail frond is generating, which means that you're increasing its function as a flight stabilizer. So because, you know, so this basically means that we can understand why the tail is longer in Zhaoianus, and it's because the elongated tail co-evolved with this very special plumage pattern that we see that is unique to Zhaoianus. So I think that's kind of neat. Now, moving along, let's take a look at Confuciusornis. And if you are in the Yishan Formation and you find a bird, like 50% chance at least it's going to be a Confuciusornis. There are thousands of Confuciusornis that have been discovered. Thousands. I mean, that's crazy. We don't usually have numbers like this in paleontology. Usually we're working with like 3 skeletons and one of them is only like consists of 2 bones, and you know, it's very limited information. But Zhaoianus, most of the specimens, Confuciusornis, most of the specimens look like this. They look like fresh roadkill, you know, it looks like this bird just got hit by a truck yesterday. So you can see this whole halo of soft tissue that can tell you about the evolution of, you know, the wing shape and these, you know, different soft tissue portions of the wing. It's very exciting. But what's cool about Confuciusornis beyond how many specimens we have is also that Confuciusornis owns the title, or holds the title, sorry, for oldest bird with a beak. So this is the first appearance of a beak within Aves. Similar to flight and dinosaurs, beaks evolved multiple times, both within birds and also amongst non-avian dinosaurs. So the beaks evolved like at least, I don't know, probably like 15 times. Another neat thing about Confuciusornis is that some specimens, like about 20% of specimens, preserve these elongate tail feathers, which you can see have like a little pennaceous portion down here. It's like something like in a racket-tail hummingbird or in a motmot, they have the same type of tail feather. It's a very common ornamental tail feather morphology, but some specimens don't preserve these feathers, as you can see. So this has been hypothesized to represent sexual dimorphism, and that the specimens that preserve these elongate tail feathers are definitely males, and specimens not preserving the tail feathers are either females or they're males who don't have the tail feathers either because they're either because they're molting, which means like, you know, they've had to replace their feathers once a year. So if they've just shed them, then they're not going to preserve, or maybe they're just not preserved at all. So it's not the best indicator of gender, but still it's really neat if we think about all these birds and all the spectacular sexual dimorphism we see in plumage, like, you know, the most classic example, of course, being a peacock. We can see that this type of sexual dimorphism in the feathers goes back in the fossil record to at least 130 million years ago. The Enantiornithes, as I mentioned, was this is this first major avian radiation. It's the dominant group of birds in the Cretaceous. They account for more than half of all known species. So the Huajiying Formation I mentioned is the oldest stage of the Jehol biota. So these enantiornithines that come from the Huajiying Formation are the oldest enantiornithines that we know of. This is the first appearance of enantiornithines in the fossil record. But these taxa that you can see on this slide here are all the oldest enantiornithines. You know, they're all from the Huajiying Formation, and they're all totally different from each other. I'm not going to go into like the little particulars and detailed morphologies. You can take my word for it. They're all very, very different from each other. And this level of diversity tells us that even though enantiornithines only appear in the fossil record 130 million years ago, they definitely existed before that. So there's, you know, we just haven't found it yet. Now, a more recent and unusual source for information about enantiornithines is these amber deposits from Myanmar. So this, even though, you know, we don't call it Burma anymore, for some reason, we still call the amber Burmese amber. But starting about 5 years ago, the first skeletal bird remains in amber were discovered. And since then, since people have recognized that vertebrates can be preserved in this amber, people have started looking for these things. And now we have almost a dozen birds or partial bird remains preserved in this amber. So here is one of these chunks of amber, a centimeter for scale, and you can see really perfectly the foot with all the reticulate scales perfectly preserved on it. And here's the tail, here's the wing going off this way, and here's the neck, and then the head comes down like that. So this is a CT scan of the skeletal elements that are preserved in there. You know, side note, tangent, you can see that the amber has been cut right through it. This is because the lead author was like so in a rush to get the specimen studied, to get it published, that rather than wait for a CT scanner that was big enough to put this big chunk of amber in there, he just like cut it into 2 pieces to like scan it separately, and cut right through the skull. So it's definitely a tragedy for paleontology. But anyways, despite the fact that we have so many species of enantiornithines from the Jehol, the enantiornithines from these Burmese amber are unlike anything we've seen anywhere else in the fossil record. And they're also preserved morphologies that are unlike anything we see in the huge diversity of living birds. So for example, here's this one specimen, here's the amber, here's the CT scan that we named Electroornis, which is basically like amber bird. And you can see that it has this really, really elongate middle toe on the foot. And I mean, you know, we all know that bird feet are totally different, going from like, you know, a duck foot to say like, you know, a falcon foot or a pigeon foot. I mean, there's all these different morphologies, right? There's webbed feet, there's not webbed feet, there's all, you know, ones with short toes, ones with long toes. Ostrich only has 2 toes. So there's a huge diversity of pedal morphologies in this 10,000 to 18,000 species of living birds. But the morphologies that we see in these enantiornithines are unlike anything we see in living birds. And so this is just kind of a reminder that this radiation of birds in the Cretaceous was not just a mirror of the radiation that we see today that then got truncated by the end Cretaceous extinction and basically started again with a different lineage of birds, the Neornithines. It's actually this Cretaceous radiation of enantiornithines occupied unique morphospace. They, you know, and they must have been doing some things that were ecologically different than modern birds. Like some ecological niches of these Cretaceous enantiornithines must have been unique to enantiornithines and are no longer utilized by modern birds. And we don't know why, but it's, you know, because these specimens, again, are very new, but it's still something that's very interesting to recognize. And once you recognize it, then you can try to understand it. So here's another specimen, amber specimen. You can see that the toes are completely hairy. Well, not, I mean, I guess feathery, not hairy, but they're covered in feathers, which is something that does occur in some living birds. But usually it often occurs in birds that live in the winter. So people have thought maybe it's to keep the toes warm. These guys were living in a tropical forest. So obviously that throws that hypothesis out the window. So we don't know what the feathers on the toes were for, but we know that they had them. And then here's another really weird specimen. And this one, it doesn't preserve any bone. It just preserves like a mold of the skin, but you can see 3 of the digits preserved here. And this one digit is really fat and wide, and it's really weird. And we also don't see that in living birds. So now the last group that I'm going to talk about is the Ornithuomorpha. And Ornithuomorphs are the group of birds that includes modern birds nested within. So they're just the more primitive relatives of living birds, but now we're on that lineage that actually has living relatives. You know, enantiornithines don't have any direct living relatives. So when we get into these more modern birds, again, I'm not going to bore you with morphological details, but we do see a jump in their morphology. We do see that the morphology, the skeletal morphology, is much more similar to living birds. And we also start to see more ecological diversity, whereas like all enantiornithines actually, I mean, I said we have this huge diversity, but it seems that almost all of them were perching birds that lived in trees. Whereas once we get into Ornithuomorpha, we see birds with elongate hind limbs that appear to have been wading, and you know, we start to see birds doing more different things. So let's talk quickly about the origin of avian physiology. So again, I said that birds are so highly modified physiologically to allow them to fly that they've kind of like over adapted themselves, and now they can just fly really, really good and fly over the Himalayas and do all these, you know, outstanding feats, physiological feats. So, you know, this is like a list of just a few of the of these features that are, at least today, unique to birds. No other living animal has them. But if you look at this list of features, you can see that, you know, as the fossil record has improved, we realize that none of these features actually are unique to birds. They're either things that evolved during avian evolution, so they were absent in the earliest birds, or they're features that were inherited by some more inclusive group of dinosaurs. And you know, during my research, when I first started, there were 2 features that it seemed we could say were maybe unique to birds, and that maybe we could use these to create this physiological or like biological definition for birds to use in, you know, together with our node-based definition that I mentioned to you guys earlier. So I'm just going to go through 2 of these features very quickly, and we're going to talk about the reproductive system, and then we're going to talk about the digestive system. So the avian reproductive system, like all other physiological aspects of birds, has been highly modified and is very different from crocodilians, the other group of living archosaurs. So for example, birds are the only reptiles that exclusively reproduce through hard eggshells. Like, for example, you know, some lizard, like snakes have evolved live birth. It's evolved in a lot of different lizard groups, or a lot of reptile groups, sorry. It's never evolved in birds that we know of. But also colored eggs are unique to birds. No other reptile has colored eggs. Birds also are characterized by a really high degree of parental care, whereas, you know, crocodilians have very low degrees of parental care. And of course, the reason we keep mentioning crocodilians is because we know that the biology of dinosaurs, non-avian dinosaurs, is intermediate between what we observe in modern birds and what we observe in crocodilians. And so we like take crocodilians and we take birds, and we call this the extant phylogenetic bracket, which basically means you're like bracketing, you know, a group in between two groups of animals that are still alive that you can observe. And we say that, you know, dinosaur biology must be intermediate between these groups. It's definitely not as straightforward as that. For example, you know, crocodilians are cold-blooded, but and they have very low metabolic rates, but it actually seems that they evolved that secondarily, that their ancestors may have had higher metabolic rates. So you have to be careful for things like that, because evolution is definitely going all over the place. But back to the bird avian reproductive system, birds are also the only amniotes with one functional ovary and oviduct. So humans, we have two, all animals have two, with the exception of most birds. There are a few exceptions within Aves. And if we look at these, some Oviraptorosaur dinosaurs, which, as I mentioned, are fairly closely related to birds within the grand scheme of the Dinosauria, there was one very important specimen that was discovered in Mongolia, and it preserves two eggs stuck in between the pubes. So this has been interpreted as a Oviraptorosaur that died while these two, you know, oocytes had ovulated and while they were being shelled in the oviducts. So this is interpreted as evidence that dinosaurs closely related to birds still had two functional ovaries and oviducts. So, you know, one of the most bizarre and interesting things that I ever had the pleasure to work on while living in China was this group of birds that we found at the Tianyu Museum of Nature. And all these birds preserved this cluster of circular objects always on the left-hand side of the body. And so we interpreted this cluster of objects as traces of the ovary, and this is consistent with the fact that the right ovary is lost in early birds. And we found this morphology even in zhaoianus, which is one of the most primitive birds, right? It's only more derived than Archaeopteryx. So this tells us that we have Oviraptorosaurs, closely related to dinosaurs, still have two ovaries. And then just as soon as you get into Aves, one ovary is already gone. So you know, this supported ornithologists' hypotheses that the loss of the right ovary was due to flight in order to reduce body mass, especially during reproduction, because reducing body mass is always advantageous for flight. And so maybe this is a tapomorphy, because we can, you know, we can bracket the loss of this right ovary to very close to the dinosaur-bird transition. And, you know, the preservation of ovarian tissue is important because ovarian tissue is gender specific. It's only found in females. So this, if you have ovaries preserved, it allows you to identify that specimen as female. And identifying fossils as, you know, at the gender level is something that paleontologists are always trying to do, but it's extremely, extremely hard. So, and I mean, again, these soft tissues don't preserve very often. So it's not exactly like, you know, the best tool for identifying the gender, but still it allows you to do it in some specimens. So here we have a A. confuciusornis, a primitive relative of confuciusornis. It has ovarian follicles preserved, so it's a female. And you can also see that it lacks the elongate tail feathers that are supposedly only present in males. So this supports the idea that we are correct in our interpretations regarding these tail feathers, that they are sexually dimorphic. Now, you know, the idea that of ovarian follicles fossilizing is, you know, it's pretty out there, I guess, because, you know, when we think of fossils, we think of just skeletons, and we forget that all these other types of soft tissues can preserve. They are very, very rare, but they can preserve, and they're not as rare as we think. But anyway, so when we published this, you know, paper with these ovarian follicles, somebody immediately, you know, commented on this paper and said, basically saying ovarian follicles cannot fossilize. These type of soft tissue structures can't fossilize, and the authors must have been wrong, and they're actually just seeds or something circular that was ingested by the animal, and it's actually in the stomach, not the ovary, right? And I will admit that in our original identification of ovarian follicles, we did it only at the macroscopic level. We're like, well, they're in the position of the ovary and it looks like an ovary, so we think it's an ovary. Like, we didn't really do any fancy analyses to support this interpretation. So, we left room for ample dissent, so fair enough, right? And, here's a picture, of a zhaoianus preserving seeds. And so they're arguing that this is similar, that we're just seeing something like this, just seeing ingested remains. And this is a paper that just came out, I think, a week ago. I put my postdoc onto the task of determining if we were right or not. And it was a very rocky road. For a while there, she was convinced that I was wrong. And I was like, okay, I can deal with that. But, in the end, it turns out that we were right and that these were, in fact, ovarian follicles. And not only can she demonstrate that they're ovarian follicles, but she can also even identify which part of the soft tissue of the ovarian follicle that is actually preserved. Because, of course, an ovarian follicle, which is basically like a yolk before it ovulates, is a three-dimensional structure. And obviously what's preserved is something that's just two-dimensional. So she was actually able to show that it's this, it's the membrane around the ovarian follicles that is actually preserved, not actually the ovarian follicle itself, but it is remnants of the ovary. So it's very cool what we're able to do nowadays with, what postdocs are able to do. With the new techniques that are being applied to paleontology, we're ever increasingly moving paleontology into actually becoming a modern biological science as opposed to something that's more geology, like paleontology being used more for dating rocks or that kind of thing. We're now really able to understand the biology of animals. We're able to find preserved blood vessels and blood cells and these kind of things. And these discoveries are very new. And but I think, once more young, bright minds are set to the task of studying these types of traces, like, who knows what aspects of the biology of extinct animals we'll be able to uncover in the future. So, again, this idea is the loss of the right ovary, is this unique to Aves? And so I thought, we could argue that this was an autapomorphy, but then recently a friend of mine did a statistical analysis of the nests of troodontids. And so this is a troodontid nest. This is an Oviraptorosaur nest. Remember, Oviraptorosaurs include the one that has the 2 eggs preserved inside the body. And you can see in their nest structure a very clear pairing of eggs. So 2 eggs are put down each time. That's very clear. Now, it's not so clear when you look at a troodontid nest. And according to my friend's statistical analysis, the distribution of eggs in the nest of a troodontid suggests that it only has a single ovary. So that would mean that I was wrong in my hypothesis that the single ovary might be an autapomorphy of birds. Now, actually, to go even further, the data has not been published yet, but it seems actually that the story of the loss of the right ovary is extremely complex and that it might have been lost multiple times. So look out for new information on that in the future. Now let's take a look at the digestive system. So again, digestive system, highly modified compared to that of other reptiles. And in fact, the avian digestive system is more efficient than that of mammals, and it's also shorter. So that means it weighs less. So, this is again, just like a story that we see repeatedly in avian evolution about how can you do something as efficiently as possible with as lightweight a structure as possible. So here we have a crocodilian digestive system compared to a bird's, and birds have 2 major segments, I guess, of the digestive system that are unique to them that are not present in crocodilians. The first is the presence of an esophageal crop. So basically birds have expanded their esophagus so that they can use it mostly to store food. There's a lot of other functions of the crop, including making something disgusting called crop milk. But anyways, mostly it's used for storing food. And in addition, the avian stomach has evolved to be 2 distinct chambers. And because when you evolve your stomach into 2 chambers, this then frees up one of the chambers to be used for something called a gastric mill. And this is when you eat a bunch of rocks, and then the rocks are in your stomach, and your muscular stomach is kind of like contracting and using these rocks in your stomach to help grind up your food. So sometimes these rocks are called their gizzard rocks, or gizzard stones, sorry. They're often called hen's teeth because birds obviously can't chew and they don't have any teeth. So if you see the presence of stones or gastroliths or gizzard stones, then it tells you then you must have a two-part stomach. The last thing I'm going to mention to you guys about the alimentary canal of birds, because I think it's just really weird and really cool, is that birds are also able to move food in between different parts of the digestive system unidirectionally. So, and humans can't do this. I mean, we can vomit, but we can't move it anywhere else in different directions. So birds will move food from the crop into the stomach when the stomach becomes free. They move food in between the two different chambers of the stomach in order to get things soaked with stomach juices up in the proventriculus and then go back down into the ventriculus to get ground up. And they're able to take food from the ventriculus, which is the caudal part of the stomach, and put it into the intestines and then move it back and forth and back and forth. So this allows them to use the same segment of the digestives of their intestines to absorb nutrients over and over, which basically makes the digestive system function as if it was a longer as if it was longer than it actually is, because they're reusing the same part over and over again. So I don't know, I think that's really weird and very cool. Now let's take a look at what we know about the digestive system in dinosaurs closely related to birds. Or not so closely related actually in this slide. So we actually have a large number of different groups of dinosaurs that preserve clusters of stones that can be interpreted as gizzard stones. If you find one or two rocks in the stomach, it's probably accidental digestion. But if you have a very distinct cluster of rocks like this, they're probably intentionally digested and indicative of a gastric mill, of a grinding gizzard. And also, because we find this in so many different groups of dinosaurs, this tells us that birds inherited the two-part stomach from their non-avian dinosaur relatives. There's those gastral masses I was mentioning. Now here we're looking at dinosaurs that are all much more closely related to birds. So here on the top, you have some Microraptor, and here you have Anchiornis. And what we see with Microraptor is that we see basically almost whole animals preserved in the stomach, and they're always preserved in the stomach. So what we can interpret about Microraptor is that it swallowed things whole, and then it just digested them slowly, and it probably would have passed small pieces of bone in its fecal matter the same way that we infer for T-Rex. Now, if you look at Anchiornis, which remember is a troodontid that I suggested troodontids are probably more closely related to birds than any other group of dinosaurs. We actually see that they have pellets in their esophagus, which means they have all these already partially digested bones get compacted together into a pellet, and then it moves into the esophagus and gets egested. So, I mean, I think a lot of us, when we were young, we dissected an owl pellet. So this is basically the type of behavior that I'm talking about. So we know that this ability to egest actually evolved in a more inclusive group of dinosaurs. It was also present in troodontids. And we can also see that it is present in some early birds as well. This is a Zhaoianus here. Now, the crop is something that we so far only have evidence for in birds. And within early birds, within these, all these birds from the jet hole that are 130 to 120 million years old, we already see a whole diversity of crop morphologies that mirrors the diversity of crop morphologies that we see in living birds. So for example, if you're a living bird with a fish that eats fish, you have a very simple crop. And it's, you've maybe even seen pictures or been at the beach and seen a bird that just has, two fish in its throat. And it's just like a simple crop that takes up the entire length of the neck. But if you're a bird that eats seeds, your pouch is sitting on your chest here, I guess, because it's much heavier. And so it's a more ventrally located crop that sits on the chest and all the seeds are right there. So this morphology, we see the same thing in these early birds. Here is a zhaoianus that has 2 whole fish preserved in its neck and its crop. And here we have a sapiornis that has a whole mass of seeds that is sitting right on its chest. So again, the same morphologies of the crop for certain diets evolved in early birds the same way they evolved in modern birds. Now, this is the holotype of zhaoianus, and the holotype of zhaoianus, like I said, it doesn't preserve any feathers, so we couldn't figure out the elongate tail, but it does preserve seeds. But the seeds, it's not very clear where the seeds are in the specimen, because the specimen, you can see it's not that great. So we don't know if the seeds came from the crop or if they came from the stomach. So I hypothesize that they must come from the crop, because at the time, all the other birds preserving seeds preserved them only in the crop. Like if you had a bird preserving ingested seeds, they were in the crop. So therefore, zhaoianus must also preserve them in the crop. That was my hypothesis. Anyways, so maybe the crop is an autapomorphy of birds, because we don't see it in any non-avian dinosaurs, but we see it immediately in birds. So maybe this is another feature we can use to define Aves. So let's take a little mini field trip to the Shandong Tianyu Museum of Nature, which is the same museum that I mentioned to you where Yi Qi is from. And so you can see this massive building. Here's a little car for scale. There are 2 more buildings exactly that same size, and one of them is dedicated entirely to collections. Now, if any of you have been lucky enough to go into the collections of a museum, you know that it's normally just like rows and rows and rows of cabinets, and you have to unlock the cabinet and you open it, and then you have to pull out drawers if you want to see anything. But here at the Tianyu Museum, all the specimens are laid out under glass. So you can just walk around and look at 220 Microraptor at once, just looking at them, and 200 Anchiornis and 100 zhaoianus. And it's really an amazing place to do research on Paravians from China. Anyways, so I went ahead and looked at all 95 zhaoianus that they have in their collection. And if you look at all these specimens, you can see when you put them all together, it's pretty clear that all the seeds are actually coming from the stomach. So this tells us actually that zhaoianus did not have a crop. So again, a crop is not something we can consider an autapomorphy of birds. It actually is something that evolved within a subset of birds. So again, now these features can be added to the list of things that occur either outside of Aves or within Aves. And but however, I still think that there are some physiological features that must characterize birds. We just haven't found them yet. So the search continues. And so what are my take-home messages? I would say the main one is just that flight has evolved in dinosaurs a bunch of times, and that's really cool. The second one is to remember that paleontology is more than just the study of bones. There's a lot of soft tissue traces out there, and we're only now just starting to take advantage of them and to see what kind of information we can glean from them. And so I think in the future, we're going to get a lot of new cool information coming out of soft tissues. And then the other, I guess, kind of a disclaimer is like, why do paleontologists still not know exactly which group of birds, a group of dinosaurs birds belongs to? This is again because flight evolved so many times. We have a lot of homoplasy. We have a lot of repeated evolution of features, which makes it very difficult to figure out, which clusters of animals are related to each other, because we base the relationships on features, but if the features have evolved multiple times, it just makes it a little bit more difficult. So have patience with us and go out there yourself and collect fossils and contribute to that growing fossil record that causes us paleontologists to constantly have to adjust our hypotheses. So thank you so much for your attention. And of course, all this work is not done solely by myself, but with a huge group of collaborators, including Corwin, who gets shout outs many times. So yeah, thank you so much for your attention. And if you have any requests for any images that you saw in the talk, or if you would like a reference for any of the things that I said, just hit me up via email. I put my email down here, and I'd be happy to provide anything that you would like.
That was really fantastic. Thank you so much. Yes, thank you for sharing all your incredible knowledge and all your incredible research.
No problem.
We've got a few questions here for you. We've got One from online asking, throughout your career, what has been your favorite discovery during fieldwork? And where is your favorite place to do fieldwork and why?
Ooh, that's a tough one because fieldwork is just, fieldwork, you go so many different places, see so many cool things. It's really hard to pick, I guess, one place. I think my most memorable trip was when I was lucky enough to go with the American Museum of Natural History to Mongolia. And they've been going to Mongolia for decades and just coming back with all these amazing discoveries. So I went with them once. It was amazing. It's just like, you're in the middle of nowhere, you have to bring all your water with you. You're not going to see anybody, there's no way you can get any help. Like, you really get this feeling of being, of being in a place where people have not been, and I think that's what's so exciting about field work. Like, you're prospecting and you see on the ground the remains of an animal that used to walk in this exact same area, except looking different, like 60 million years ago or 120 million years ago, and you're the first human or living creature, conscious living creature, I guess, to see that remnant of that animal. I don't know, it's a very exciting feeling to find a fossil. It's very addictive, I will let you know that. But in terms of my favorite discovery, it's nothing related to birds or dinosaurs. It was in China in Inner Mongolia province, and I found a tooth and nobody had any idea what it was, and I thought that was really cool. I still don't actually know what it was. I never went to follow up with that. But yeah, I think that just like, finding something that no one knows what it is, it's exciting.
That sounds like an amazing adventure. Next question here. Have you ever considered using flight simulation software, such as the BAT simulator developed at MIT to study Cretaceous birds, Microraptor, and Scansoriopterygids?
Yeah, it's definitely something I've considered. Corwin and I actually put together a big grant to use modeling software to try to understand flight a little bit better. We didn't end up getting the grant. I mean, I still think we want to do the research. We just haven't had time to do it. But I'll also be completely honest. I'm a traditionally trained paleontologist. That's my excuse anyways. So a classically trained paleontologist. I'm pretty terrible with technology. That's why I can't even get a video to work in my PowerPoint. So any collaboration I would do studying flight using this type of software would definitely have to be a collaboration. But I would love to do it, and it's something that's definitely on my list.
Well, you've heard it. If anybody listening would like to collaborate, here's a chance.
Email on the screen.
Next question from Lucerta. Does the wings of Yiqi, Y-I-Q-I, have barbs and or barbules? And she says, it seems interconnecting structures such as barbs can strengthen the integrity of the wing, perhaps somehow against the air drag. Yiqi
and other Scansoriopterygids, we have no evidence that they have complex feathers. So there's no evidence that they had barbs or barbules or anything. The only thing we see are just a very simple filamentous feather that we call dino fuzz. So it's just like a single shaft, essentially like an isolated barb, basically. So we don't have any of the branching structures. There's no evidence of that in Scansoriopterygids.
Awesome, thank you. Robin would like to know, what is the most interesting fossil that you've ever worked with?
I would have to say the Scansoriopterygids. They're just so cool, they're just so weird, and there's just, our understanding of them has changed enormously during the time that I've been a paleontologist, which I think is just really exciting to behold, like going from thinking it's something like a little dinosaur eye to realizing that it's a bat-winged dinosaur. Like, how cool is that? And yes, and because we have so little data on these specimens, there's still so much potential to learn so much about them. So yeah, I just consider myself very lucky to have participated in the papers on them. I have to admit that like I didn't do that much for either paper, but I'm like very glad that I can call myself part of the team. So I guess when it comes to things that I have done most of the the work on these on the fossils, I would have to say it's things like the ovarian follicles. And also I described one, a bird with lung tissue. So it's really, I think it's really neat starting to see these soft tissue structures. And of course, like, you know, I have a PhD in geology, not biology. So every time I get something like, oh, the birds with ovarian follicles or this bird with lung tissue, it just means that I have to learn so much. I have to like start dragging out all this biology literature, learn everything I can about the avian respiration system or the avian digestive system. And also, like, you know, learning it's fun and it's exciting. It's good for you. So I really appreciate those challenges.
That leads in really well to our next question. If you weren't studying prehistoric birds, what would you like to study?
My true love actually are plesiosaurs, like specifically elasmosaur plesiosaurs, the ones with the really long necks. I don't like pliosaurs, like, but yeah, I love them. I have a tattoo on my leg of a plesiosaur. I'm not going to try to show it to you guys, but yeah, I almost went and studied marine reptiles with Ryosuke Motani, but in the end, you know, like the choice of where to go to grad school is like it's basically decides what you're going to end up studying, and I made the choice to study birds, and it's been good to me. So, yeah.
Very cool. We've got another question coming from our live audience. Did any female paleontologists inspire you to become a paleontologist or a geologist, as you are?
Not a female paleontologist so much, but my mom inspired me to be a geologist. So you know, my dad is an artist, and we were kind of struggling when I was young, and my mom decided she wanted to go back to school so the family wouldn't struggle so much. And you know, my mom's just the smartest, toughest, hardest working person I've ever met. She had 4 kids, got a perfect score on the GRE, got offered like incredible scholarships to go back to school. And last minute, you know, she was going to do something that was like a quick and dirty degree just to get a job, just to support the family. And last minute, she was like, you know, I'm going to do what I've always loved, and I'm going to do geology. And that's always been really inspirational to me. And definitely when I decided to get interested in paleontology, I was told, don't do it. Like it's very competitive. There's no jobs. It's, you know, like it's not an easy career path. And, but because of my mother, I was like, no, I'm going to do what I'm passionate about and what I love. And I don't regret that at all.
Sounds like a really incredible role model. Right. I think that's all the questions we have for today. I just want to say again, thank you so much. This has been a really interesting talk.
Thank you so much for having me. I wish I could be out there with you guys giving a talk in person. It's a beautiful museum, but yeah, you know, Corona times.
Yes, correct. But yes, thank you so much for joining us via the amazing internet.
Yeah, again, sorry for the technical difficulties, but I'm glad everything worked out in the end.
So are we. Right. So those of you listening online, join us on August 22nd, Saturday, for Rebecca Weiss, who's going to be talking about the latest research at our own bone bed, the Pipestone Creek bone bed.